Hey guys, Soldier for Christ here again. I know I said part 3 was going to be how to defend Christianity, but I think we should address the atheist side a little bit more, get into some more points, play some clips of, people that have been debating for a while and really could have some good advice too. So, alright, let's go ahead and get into this.
One of the central arguments of the God Delusion, Richard Dawkins' book, is the famous schoolboy argument. If we believe in a creator, we'll have to ask who created the creator. Now, the first point I would make about that is this. If you ask the question, who created God, you are thinking of created gods. Now, the ancient world knew all about created gods. Actually, we call them idols. And people don't believe in them usually nowadays. So if Richard Dawkins really thinks that what he's demolishing is belief in created gods, then good for him. But he could have written a far shorter book, because millions of us don't need any convincing that created gods are a delusion. So that's the first point. And I believe it's quite a serious point, actually. Because if he thinks that the God means you must be able to say who created God, then he does fall foul of that criticism. Now, you can only ask the question, coming at it from another perspective, if you cannot conceive of an eternal God. Christianity, of course, does not believe in a created God. It believes in God who is eternal and is the creator of everything else. In other words, God is uncreated. So what I'm claiming, to use mathematical language, is that the category of the uncreated is not empty. Now, it could be that Richard Dawkins has difficulty with the notion of the uncreated. Although, and I'd like to know the answer to this, I don't know the answer to this, does he believe that matter and energy have existed forever? Because if he does, as many people do who are atheists, then they do believe in something eternal. So the problem must be that they can believe in something eternal, but they don't believe in an eternal person, an eternal God. But where's the logical difficulty? If you admit that something eternal exists, then postulating that an eternal person exists. On the other hand, if they believe that matter and energy are finite, we can ask them their own question: who created that? And who created whatever created that, and so on. You have an infinite regress unless you can see that the buck must stop somewhere. And of course, the Christian doctrine is that God existed eternally, so that by definition, the creation buck, so to speak, stops there. So I really think that in a way, the game is given away by asking that question. Dawkins is thinking of created gods, which are a delusion. One of the issues related to the who created the creator is this, that Richard Dawkins, and it's the heart of his argument in chapter 4, I think, of his book, he says that God is clearly no solution to any question, because, by definition, God is more complex than the thing you're trying to explain. So that's absurd. And I want to say, no, it is not absurd. That in ordinary life we're used to this all the time. And the illustration I often give is that if in a cave in China we find 2 scratches, simply 2 scratches, and a Chinese archaeologist exclaims, human intelligence, and I say, but don't be ridiculous, those are only 2 scratches. You're postulating a human mind to explain them. The human mind's far more complex than those 2 scratches, so your explanation is no explanation at all. Now, she might well say, look, those 2 scratches form a Chinese character, which means a human being, the Chinese character Hun. And because the scratches are semiotic, they carry meaning, they're signs, the only explanation that makes sense is in terms of something much more complicated than them. So in itself, the idea that an explanation cannot be more complex than the thing that's being explained is simply false. If you and I went to the planet Mars, and as we came into land, we saw little piles of titanium cubes, perfectly formed, and the first pile had 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, and so on in prime ascending order. we'd know immediately that an intelligence was responsible for it. We wouldn't know which intelligence, but we know that that intelligence is far more complex than those cubes. So the thing that Dawkins seems to be refusing to allow is the fact that an explanation can lead you upwards in complexity. Also, I'd want to say that explanations can become increasingly complex. You think of a falling apple and its first description in terms of Newton's law of gravitation. Well, already many people won't follow that. But if I then start describing it that actually Newton wasn't quite right, Einstein came along and said it's due to warping in space-time, that's left most people miles behind. So the explanation is actually getting more complex. And for some fundamental things at the quantum level, we have theories like quantum mechanics and even more so quantum electrodynamics that are horrendously complicated. But people believe in them, not because they're simple, they're not simple, but because simplicity is not the only criterion of truth. Sometimes people like me who are scientists and believe in God are accused of believing in a God of the gaps, which amounts, crudely put, to, well, we take some phenomenon in the universe, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. And it needs to be emphasized there that although gaps may be interesting, and we can come to those in a minute, the major evidence for God is not in what we don't understand, but in what we do understand. First of all, in the very fact we can do science. That, to my mind, is one of the great evidences of a divine mind behind the universe, as I argued earlier. And then it's the whole show. The heavens declare the glory of God is the way the Hebrew poet put it. And that would be my initial reaction. I think perhaps the best way to explain it is in terms of Sir Isaac Newton, probably the most gifted scientist who's ever lived. When he discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, now I understand how the planets move, so I don't need God. Not at all. In fact, the more he understood, the more he worshipped God who'd done it that clever way. So he wasn't believing in a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. He was saying, I can explain it to a certain extent. And these explanations are so wonderful and they can be compressed so brilliantly into mathematical formulae that that is evidence of God. But then there could just be gaps in knowledge that are widened by science or increased by science. And one of those, which I discuss in detail in my book, has to do with the origin of life. In 1953, when Miller-Urey won the Nobel Prize for their experiments on bombarding a mixture that was supposed to resemble a primeval soup with electricity and discovered some of the building blocks of life, of the proteins, the amino acids, that was hailed as the discovery of the secret of life, and they got the Nobel Prize for it. But we're now over 50 years later, and the difficulties seem much greater because at that time they didn't know of the digital nature of life as reflected in the DNA code. So that there, it would seem to me, is a gap that's being revealed by science. I think I would want to say this, that no, I don't believe in a God of the gaps. That is, my faith in God does not depend in me using God as a place filler for the bits of the universe that I don't yet know how to explain scientifically. As far as science goes, in terms of the evidence that science gives pointing towards God, I would want to say it's the science I do understand that points me towards God, not the science I don't. That's a very interesting question, that people who are both scientists, they look at the same evidence, and I feel it points towards a creator and other people feel it points away. How does that possibly happen? I try as hard as I possibly can to look at it through the eyes of an atheist. Now, some atheists are quite explicit that their atheism comes first. One of the most famous is Richard Lewontin, the professor of genetics, who said that it wasn't his science that compelled him to accept a materialistic explanation of the universe. It was an a priori materialism. You start with materialism. And he said that materialism is absolute. And I'm quoting now, we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, he is breathtakingly honest. He starts with his atheism, and he uses that as a lens through which he looks at his science. So, in one sense, I can't answer the question because I can't speak for other people. The evidence is out there, and all I feel I can do is say, well, to my mind, that points towards God, and here are the reasons. And it's up to someone listening to me to determine, well, is that a priori theism, or does it really constitute evidence? I think it does. I've tried to take very seriously the atheistic case. What disturbs me about the new atheists is they do not appear to take very seriously the Christian case. So there's a bit of an imbalance there. Well, I think that the best way we can prepare ourselves is to get engaged. We don't learn how to defend Christianity by reading books about it. Books are very useful and very helpful, but we need to be engaged, talking to people around us one-on-one and finding out what questions they're asking. So very often when I meet someone for the first time, I ask them questions and keep on doing so until they ask me one. So often we are coming to people with preconceived ideas and we want to tell them what we believe. But we need to be, at least I feel, we need to be genuinely interested in what other people think. And so I want to find out what they think. So I'll keep asking them until they ask me. Now the crucial thing then is this, that when they ask me something to which I don't know the answer, which is a highly likely, statistically probable event, is that we don't try to pretend to know what we don't know. There's nothing more nauseating in people's eyes as an obvious attempt to answer a question when we clearly haven't a clue. Show a willingness to go and find out the answer. And it's then that our own questioning will become serious. And we'll be going looking for answers, not as solutions to academic questions merely, but because someone asked us the question and we need to give them an answer. People often ask me what apologetics is. And in a way, the word is very unfortunate because, first of all, it suggests to an English audience of apologizing for something. And we normally apologize for something that we've done wrong. So it's a negative kind of word. And I think it's important to realize this is not actually an English word at all. It's a transliteration, not a translation, of a Greek word, apologia, which simply means defense. And it's used in the New Testament many times, particularly by the Apostle Paul, in terms of his defending the Christian message. In other words, he was coming in a pluralistic world with many different philosophies and so on. And the moment he started to talk about Christ and the message of the Christian gospel, people would ask questions. There would be misunderstandings. There would even be later on misrepresentations. And so Paul would be answering questions. He'd be defending Christianity. And that is what is meant by apologetics. The context of the famous words, and the words are, always be ready to give a defense to those that ask you concerning the hope that is within you. The context is fear. Just a few statements earlier, Peter is talking about fear. Don't be afraid of what other people are afraid of. Don't feel threatened. So it's quite clear that this business of giving an answer wasn't just sitting around an armchair with a few cozy friends chatting. It was defending Christianity, often under very hostile fire. And one of the things that affects us, all of us, I don't care who we are, is that we do get threatened and we do feel afraid. So Peter is saying, don't fear. Well, of course, it's all very well to be told not to fear. But what's going to help us not be afraid? And it's the next statement that seems to me to be central in this whole issue. Don't fear, but sanctify in your hearts Christ as Lord. That means to set apart Christ as number one in our lives, as the basic center, the central focus, and we set him apart as Lord and governor of our lives, and then be ready to give an answer. And that tells me also that it's just not simply a question of mastering a whole lot of intellectual answers to sophisticated questions. It starts with an attitude of heart towards the Lordship of Christ, and it's a question of obeying him, and from that, gaining the strength to attempt at least to answer the questions that people throw at us. One of the big arguments that the new atheists make is this. It's their observation, and of course it's a common observation, we all make it, that we are ethical people, we have moral standards and so on and so forth. And in their crusade against God, they realize there could be a problem for some people, because traditionally, in Western Europe certainly, the baseline for ethics, the guarantor of ethics, if you like, has been God. That's the traditional ethic based on Christianity. Now, if God does not exist, and some of the contemporary atheists are right, then there's no such thing as absolute morality. Everything ends up being relative, and we're all aware of the postmodern phenomenon. It's very hard to believe from practical experience that everything is relative morally. Some things appear to be absolutely wrong. For example, torturing babies. We have a sense that every sane person will reject that as being absolutely wrong. But the existence of such moral absolutes is highly significant. Now, on the other hand, if one is to take the atheist view, the question arises, where are you going to get your base for ethics from? Now, various attempts have been made to get it in the genetic structure of human beings, in social behavior, and so on. Well, this is a very big and important issue, but to cut a very long story short, it seems to me that these attempts to generate ethics bottom up fail for precisely the same reason that attempts to base rationality bottom up instead of top down fail. How could any configuration of genetics or whatever impose a moral obligation on us? And I would be supposed as to say that a lot of the moral confusion that exists in politics, in law, in medicine and in business arises from that attempt. Every business and every profession will have its mission statement in terms of its ethical code of practice. But I notice that if you ask the question, who said so, what's the basic authority, there aren't any real answers, because having dismissed God as a possibility, they find that there's no other substantive argument that they can bring. I would want to argue that it is actually impossible. Ethics involves top-down causation and cannot be deduced simply from a bottom-up system of arguments. Can one see evidence of a creator in nature? I believe that one can. So my first response to it is this, that the Christian cradle gave birth to modern science in the sense that the contemporary scientific set of investigations arose because of the conviction that there is a designer, there is an intelligence, there is a God who created and upheld nature. That set people free and encouraged them actually to do science. And one of the greatest evidences to me that that is the case is the fact that we can do science at all, that we can do mathematics, and we find the mathematics that we do in our heads in here corresponds to what we find in the universe out there. It reflects what Einstein said. The only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. He saw there was a problem. How is it that the human mind in here can develop formulae, equations, mathematical descriptions that reflect what's going on out there? Well, atheism, which is one worldview that's very dominant in the academy today, tells us that the human mind is simply the accidental byproduct of a mindless, purposeless process. Well, one begins to wonder how such an apparatus could begin to deliver any kind of truth at all. And indeed, many noted philosophers like Alvin Plantinga are bearing down on this, that this atheistic explanation of the universe undermines the very rationality which all scientists must believe in to do their science. Whereas Christianity tells us, or theism more generally tells us, that the reason we can do science is that the same God that created the universe out there ultimately is responsible for the creation of the human mind in here. And that makes perfect sense. So that I would start with the very doing of science, the very order that we discover through science is a pointer towards something deep and intelligent underlying that order. But then, of course, I would come to the actual science itself, that we discover that we live in a fine-tuned universe. The fundamental constants of nature have to be very precisely within very small tolerances if you are to have a universe in which carbon-based life is possible. And I'm interested in what some of the physicists, who are not necessarily theists, are saying about it, that it is an overwhelming indicator of intelligence. One tends to agree with Fred Hoyle, who, when he found the carbon resonances that are necessary for carbon to be created, said something like a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry. So that would be my start in indicating that science points towards the existence of God. And one of the most eminent cosmologists and astronomers, the father of modern astronomy, Alan Sandage, points out that the very existence of this order is something that points him in the direction of believing in God. For him, that's the only explanation of the order that makes any sense. This question of the relationship of faith to reason is one that one comes up against all the time. And the question is often put as if faith and reason were opposed. That, to my mind, is nonsense. It's coupled with an impression that people get that faith is something that occurs only in religious situations and therefore isn't worth talking about. Richard Dawkins talks about faith heads, or roughly equivalent to cloth heads, I suppose, and that reason is associated with science and therefore we take it seriously. Well, that is to make an error in both directions. Firstly, faith and reason walk hand in hand in both science and theology. So that we need to unpack this just a little bit. Faith, of course, our English word comes from the Latin word fides, which means trust. And in its normal usage, faith, reason and evidence are words that belong very much together. If I go into my bank manager with a project of making money, the issue for the bank manager is, can he place his faith in me? Can he trust me? Of course, in these days of financial crises, the problem might be the other way round. Can I trust the bank manager? But leaving that aside, can he trust me? Now, he will want reasons to trust me. He'll want evidence on which to base his faith in me. And he will ask me a whole series of very penetrating questions in order to see whether his faith is justified. And that applies right across the board. When we say we have faith in something, we trust it, we believe in it, the next logical question is, what reasons have you got? What evidence have you got for believing it? So if I say God is the creator of the universe, you are perfectly justified in saying, what reasons have you got? So that we need to distinguish faith from blind faith. What makes this discussion very complex is that many of the new atheists regard all faith as blind faith. But that is absolute nonsense. A man's faith in his wife is not blind. I even discussed this with Richard Dawkins, and he quite rightly gave me many reasons why he has faith in his wife. That is, we immediately see that that kind of faith can have reasons. It is evidence-based faith, but it is nonetheless faith. So that to say that all faith is blind faith is simply wrong in using faith in its general context, but it's also wrong using faith in its specifically religious context. The early scientists and many contemporary scientists weren't fools in putting their faith in God because they believed there was evidence for it. And it's interesting that in the part of the New Testament that is devoted to explaining what faith is, one of the major books, that is the book we call the Gospel by the Apostle John, he says that he has written, collected together all this evidence, and I quote, "These things are written that you might believe," that is, have faith in, "that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name." In other words, John is not asking us to put blind faith in Jesus. It's the exact opposite. He said, here's the evidence I've collected as an eyewitness, and this evidence forms the basis on which you can rest your faith. That is, he is appealing for evidence-based faith. It is, of course, the fact there is such a thing as blind faith, and it's very dangerous, particularly when it's coupled with unscrupulous religious authority. And I will agree entirely with the new atheists in condemning it, but I will not agree with them that that is the only kind of faith there is, because after all, some of them at least are scientists, like Dawkins and Dennett, for instance. So they have faith in common with every other scientist who ever lived in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Their science doesn't give them that. As my teacher of quantum physics at Cambridge points out in many of his books, Sir John Polkinghorne, physics is powerless, he says, to explain its faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Why is that? Because in order to do any physics, you must believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Now here comes the major irony. The atheists claim they don't have faith. Oh yes, they do, in their science, in the rational intelligibility of the universe. But half a minute, where's the evidence that that faith is justified? In their worldview, it doesn't exist, because their worldview is that human intelligence is simply the product of a mindless, unguided process. But if that's the case, why on earth would you give it any credence whatsoever? Why would you believe any thing that it produced? The interesting thing about the evolutionary doctrines that these new atheists base so much of their worldview on is that they are geared to survivability, not towards truth. So why would you believe anything produced by an apparatus that is thrown up by such a mindless, unguided process? What am I saying? I'm saying, firstly, there is such a thing as blind faith. It is very dangerous in the religious sphere, but it seems to me that the atheists are coming very near to being guilty of blind faith when they trust the human mind for which they haven't a shred of evidence on their own hypotheses, in their own worldview, that it should be considered as reliable. In other words, scientists have to have faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. The rational justification of that faith came originally from Christianity. Atheism simply doesn't have any. So this matter of faith, evidence and reason is something we need to think about very carefully. The question of science and miracle is a very important question. The confusion that arises in many people's minds are that the laws of nature are themselves causes, but they're not. No billiard ball has ever been set in motion by Newton's laws of motion. People wielding billiard cues set billiard balls in motion. The laws of motion, Newton's laws of motion, will describe the way in which a billiard ball moves, of course, once it has been set in motion. But the laws are not causes in that sense. And they will describe its trajectory on the billiard table, provided, of course, nobody sticks their hand in and lifts the ball off the table. That's the first thing I want to say. The laws are descriptions, our descriptions of what we observe to happen, the patterns we observe, and on the basis of which we can make predictions. But the difficulty is that we use the word law in two senses, in a scientific sense and in a legal sense. Let me illustrate this with a very helpful remark that C.S. Lewis made in this very context. That if I put £100 plus £100 in my drawer at my bedside tonight, 100 plus 100 is 200. That's a law of arithmetic. Now, if in the morning I discover £50, I do not say that the laws of arithmetic have been broken. I say that the laws of England have been broken. But how do I know that the laws of England have been broken? Because I know the law of arithmetic. In other words, it's my knowledge of the regularity of the law, if you like, that enables me to tell that someone has put their hand into the drawer. Another event has transpired, and it's my knowledge of that law that enables me to say that something outside that system, if you like, has occurred. Now let's extrapolate this up onto a much higher level. As a Christian, I believe there is a God who's designed this universe and upholds it. And he has built into it those regularities which we have encoded in our scientific laws. They're the regularities. They are the way in which the universe normally works. But God the Creator is not a prisoner of those laws. He can feed, if he so wishes, a new event into the system. And of course, as C.S. Lewis points out, the laws immediately take over. If you turn water into wine, then if you drink too much of it, it will intoxicate you, according to the normal law of nature. But the laws of nature cannot forbid God feeding a new event into nature. After all, the laws of nature cannot prevent God creating the whole thing in the first place with the regularities that science has observed. So it seems to me to be a very wrong kind of deduction to say that science prevents somehow miracles. Now, of course, scientific observation can make miracles very improbable. We observe that dead people don't normally rise. That is, of course, the case. But you see, if you're going to recognize a miracle, and after all, a miracle is by definition something very much out of the ordinary, you've got to know what the corresponding regularities are. Otherwise, you couldn't tell whether the thing was a miracle or not. You see, David Hume and many others thought, and it's still very popular, the idea that the people that wrote the New Testament, for instance, wherein the miracles of Jesus are recorded, were of course pre-scientific. They hadn't a notion about the laws of nature, and therefore they found it very easy to believe a miracle. That's nonsense, actually. For instance, Joseph, when he discovered that his bride-to-be was pregnant, didn't say, oh, a marvelous miracle. Of course, yes. No, he wanted to divorce her. Why? Because he knew as well as any modern where babies came from. He wasn't an idiot. He knew the normal law of nature. And so it took an enormous amount of persuading, actually directly by God himself, before Joseph understood that here's something very special, indeed extraordinarily special. This was God feeding himself into nature, not simply a new event. But the point is very clear. It was made again by a blind man whom Jesus healed. He said, look, he said to the people that were questioning him, he said, from the very beginning of the world, it's never been heard that a man that is born blind gets his sight back. He knew the norm, and so he recognized that what Jesus did was a miracle. Of course, they are right who warn us that we shouldn't accept all miracle stories. Some of them are bizarre and absurd in the extreme, and that's why I'm deliberately confining myself in this little discussion to the miracles claimed on Jesus' behalf in the New Testament. We've got to take each one on its merits, and therefore we've got to ask, with David Hume, what is the evidence on which this is based? And because some of these things are so staggering, in the particular the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we'd have to have enormous evidence. But I would want to claim that we do. And one of the strongest bits of evidence is the rise of the Christian church and what lies behind it. But that's a topic for another time. There's a very popular view going around that science and religion are essentially hostile to each other. They've been at war not only since the Enlightenment, but since ever science started. That is regarded by serious historians of science, who are not necessarily all Christians by any means, as a myth. There are, of course, as is usual, reasons for the myth. And often quoted are two incidents, historical incidents. First of all, the treatment of Galileo by the Roman Catholic Church, and secondly, the very famous debate between Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog as he was called, and Bishop Soapy Sam Wilberforce in the Oxford Natural History Museum in 1860, a year after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. Now, serious historical work has been done on both of these incidents and the way they have become cultural icons used in the defense of this conflict thesis that religion is at war with science. And it has turned out that neither of those incidents will bear anything like the weight that is put on them. In fact, they do not confirm the conflict myth at all. One could sum up and say, in the words of Colin Russell, who's a professor of the history of science at the Open University in Britain, that the conflict metaphor is so extremely not congruent with the actual facts that what needs to be explained, and now I'm quoting him, what needs to be explained is how it ever could have arisen in the first place. To put alongside that the simple fact that far from religion and science being in conflict, Christianity was the cradle out of which science grew. And C.S. Lewis sums up Sir Alfred North Whitehead's work on this, and Merton's thesis, and various other things magnificently in the following statement. He says, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Far from religion hindering the progress of science, it was the basic conviction that there was a God, a lawgiver, behind this perceived order that spurred people on, like Newton and Kepler and Galileo and so on, to make the magnificent contributions to science that they did.